Greetings, everybody. I'm here today basically on behalf of the Royal Societies of Australia, rather than just me. And you can look in the background papers and so on that have been circulated, and you'll find a whole lot of detail about what we did. The Royal Societies were concerned to try and develop some kind of action around the theme that there's been severe degradation of the Australian landscape, and researching for a new approach to land and seascapes in Australia. The actual event turned out to be what we described there as an historic collaboration involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, industry practitioners and thinkers. I think we thought the academics there were the thinkers, but there are others as well. The whole aim, there were two important aims. One was to bridge Indigenous agricultural, scientific, economic and social perspectives. And the other one was that we didn't want just more laments about history and so on and slogans, but rather suggestions about practical action that related to public good. The illustration I've given you there, you've just heard how 70% of Australia is the outback. A whole lot of the rest of it is dramatically transformed. This is an example of that. This is up near Mergen, Queensland, where I come from. This is just near our family farm. It's been there 111 years now. There's Roman countryside there still. There are 3 protected areas just near there. The Mergen fossils, who's heard of the Mergen fossils? 55 million years old, just behind where the photo was taken a little way in a couple of secret places that I won't tell you where they are. You know, the oldest mammal, the oldest bird, songbird and so on. Interestingly, the crop you can see there is Jerboisia, which is a local native plant, which is the one that's used to extract scopolamine, a drug that's used all over the world. It only comes from a few places in that area. We've talked a bit about conservation and so on. You can see the banks there, the contour banks. The idea of contour banks was pioneered in the South Burnett area way back in the 1930s. The issue there was soil erosion, because once you cleared the vine scrub, the first time you ploughed it, a whole lot was gone. The issues that came up were the need to deal with market failures, which people have mentioned today, and as is already apparent from a number of presentations, not always well enough defined, but everybody knows one when they see it. The outcomes of market failures can range from very, very local ones, such as the spread of weeds and sediment flows from a neighbouring farm into a stream and so on, right through to global ones, because although federal government doesn't like to hear this, every bit of fossil fuel use we have in Australia contributes to a global impact. We also have to try to recover from past inconsistent, fragmented and often short-term efforts. People have mentioned some of that today as well. From past mismanagement, which was often, as people recognise now, unintentional. People didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know when they cleared the vine scrub that they'd cause erosion. And in the case of Queensland, a lot of the degradation in terms of wholesale land clearing and so on was actually required by law. We still haven't recovered from that. Now, we also took the position we needed to build on the history we've got. We don't have a kind of a clean slate, and neither can we dismiss our history. We had in mind in particular the Aboriginal Foundation, which involves practices developed over tens of thousands of years. The production systems we use, nearly all brought from overseas, often with far too little regard for their potential impacts in the Australian scene. And the laws governing systems and many of our social institutions and our dominant economic relationships, which people have mentioned many times today, are inherited largely from Britain and other European countries. So we have to start with that. We also have to adapt to climate changes. to global changes. We talk about climate all the time, but there are also changes to biodiversity, landscapes, hydrology, and from pollution. These have unpredictable outcomes and more extreme events. The term natural disasters has been used a couple of times today. Some of us think it's better to talk about natural events, which can have catastrophic and disastrous effects. But a cyclone is not a disaster. It's just a natural phenomenon that's out there. We've also seen far too much social and economic decline in our rural communities. Too many services have been lost. That's been emphasised in a number of presentations already. One of the outcomes we're after here, and Ben Lyon's work and so on and others brings this out, whatever we do, one of the aims should be to foster increased prosperity for the future, or even renewed prosperity in many cases, but with a long-term perspective. Now, the picture I've given you here, that's the farm. I lived on a farm in Canberra for 20 years. That's it there with the green roof house. Brindabella Ranges in the back. So again, this is a transformed landscape. That area was originally settled way back, I think, the 1820s. There's still some remnant bush you can see down there. That's because this was a back paddock on a big farm that didn't ever go near much. And in the foreground is one of the biggest vineyards in the Canberra district, Wallaroo Wines, which again, that illustrates the climate change point. The wine industry around Canberra, like other places, is very sophisticated. The pioneers there were all CSIRO scientists. So they measure every little thing. You know, they can count the leaves on the vines almost. And so they keep good records too. The date of harvest of the vines has been becoming earlier every year since the vines were planted, starting back in the 1970s. There's also a social element here. The young lady you can see in the foreground, Ernby, she was one of our backpacker workers, in that case from Korea. There are fewer of those now, which is again changing the whole lot of things in a lot of rural areas to do with employment, social relations, and God knows what else. And given the pandemic, we have to assume that people movement may continue to be limited, and so there'll be fewer of those people in the long term. And I suggest, some others have, as population, that'll be reinforced by increased population pressures in other places, which generate more opportunities for zoonoses and for the resultant pandemics. The picture here just gets to planning. This illustrates some of those points people have been making. That's the main beach on the Gold Coast, a real picture. And it shows erosion from the sea and so on. And as some people may know, a lot of the Gold Coast coast is relatively artificial because of engineering works done decades ago, but it's kept pretty stable as it is. But it's bound to change. You can see there the kind of erosion areas right up against the houses. On the planning point, you can see a pink house there. Some of our family lived in that for a few years. It's now demolished, and given the, I don't know how to put this, it's not too rude, but a planning system. But instead of being left vacant, and the pink house was knocked down, as part of the planned managed retreat from the coast, which is going to have to happen down there sometime. There's a 5-storey building being put there, and if you want to go and live there and you spare $6 million, you can. The rest of that picture is serrated tussock. That's the worst perennial weed in pastoral country in temperate Australia. And as you can see there, it forms a monoculture. What that illustrates again is a point that's come up a bit, is a need for a holistic landscape, etc. approaches to things. We always say kill the tussock, but if all you do is kill the tussock, you'll just have more tussock next time. So it illustrates that if you want to deal with that kind of pest, and renew prosperity and that kind of thing, you have to have a much bigger plan, of which killing the tussie is only one little part. As we went through our work, there are two key conclusions seem to come up. One, we can't rely on a patchwork of individual unconnected initiatives. And I've heard so many things today that illustrate that, including what Pepe just said, the philanthropy isn't going to rescue us and so on, the governments aren't going to, and all that kind of thing. The other thing we came up with was the need to adopt the principle of custodianship as the basis of our relationship with land and seascapes. Now that comes from the Aboriginal experience. One of our presenters was Mary Graham from the University of Queensland, and lives in the same suburb as me on the Gold Coast, coincidentally. And she describes the custodial ethic this way. It emerges from an ancient reciprocal relationship with nature, an ethic of looking after, stewardship, caring for, and the obligation to look after land that nurtures. I would commend, when you look at the papers we've circulated, there's some references to a couple of Mary Graham's articles. She's brilliant at summing up so many things that you can't talk about them all. Every bit of philosophy you ever heard of and so on, and a great understanding of Aboriginal ways across Australia. What's going on here? I've lost a page here, don't worry about that. We came up with a number of suggestions about the way forward, the practical thing. You see them there. I already mentioned the obligation of custodianship for the country. Public money for public goods, that's been talked about a lot today as well. Although the problem we still have there is a kind of a definitional one. First, what do we mean by public goods, and how do we work out systems and schemes that make the public contribution for the work that's done by private people or NGOs or whoever. Polluter pays, which landholders in Australia by and large don't like to hear that kind of dreadful talk, that they should have to pay or contribute in some way for any harm they might cause. Precautionary decision making, well, some of us have thought for decades that that's pretty self-evident. It's often dismissed as some kind of scientific mumbo jumbo or something. But in practice, to my mind, it's really about thinking about things like preferred futures. And there are practical, you can give it practical content if you turn your mind to it. And it also reflects what Mary Graham says in an Aboriginal perspective, that whatever you're doing, you're thinking about how that will benefit the next generation and the one after that. The continuous learning and improvement, well, vested interests, I'm involved with the Australian Land Management Group. That's all about exactly that principle. And others have talked about that as well. Environmental gains for economic activities. Which isn't there, but that's one we stole from Dieter Helm in England, that in planning systems and so on, you shouldn't approve something unless you can show there's going to be an environmental gain from its implementation. The regional, etc. perspective has come out a lot today. That one's difficult. Way back when I was first involved in land care activities, that was taken for granted. That was in the Canberra, New South Wales, Murrumbidgee kind of area. And yet people today, just about every presenter is lamenting the fragmentation and project by project and property by property kind of thing that goes on now. Australia a long time ago used to be regarded as quite good at making structural adjustment arrangements as times change and so on. You know, our family used to be in the dairy industry. That's one that went through some of those kinds of programs. And we seem to have lost that. We need to reinvent it. And then what for some of us is nearly the most important thing is law reform. And by that, I don't mean fiddling around the edges. We've got heaps of laws now. In fact, there's a Queensland law that says do no harm to the environment. That's hardly anyone's even heard of it, let alone being forced to implement it.
Nelson, I'm really sorry.
So we'd like to see a law reform that would make what I'm calling the safeguarding of effective functioning of ecosystems the overriding consideration in public and private decision making. Now, there's been talk today of regenerative agriculture and things of that nature. The picture there is Martin Royd's place down in Braidwood. Google up Martin Royd's and you'll get pages and pages. He, like Damien Maloney earlier, absorbs knowledge like a sponge and has taken up and tested just about every kind of regen kind of activity you can think of with stunningly effective results. You know, his costs have gone down to hardly anything. His profits have gone up 230% and so on. And you can see a whole lot of us were there, goggle-eyed, learning about stuff. The particular thing there, it relates to chain of ponds. In parts of New South Wales, including the Canberra area, historically nearly every watercourse was a chain of ponds. In this case, he used advice from Peter Andrews, who you've all heard of, to put in systems, and that's one of them. In no time at all, there's water and so on. Anyway, it works very well and shows how it can be done. This one, I'm just going
to let you know that we're heading for 17 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Start now. You don't have to wait till the whole world changes and big acts are passed and things like that. We can all do things. Adds up the big things. Don't wait. Start now. That is not an ad for Toyota Land Cruisers. That was again a land care style thing out at Mitchell on Bill Douglas's place. The amount of abundance. Thank you very much for your attention.